My ancestors are Peaky Blinders, so this book is fascinating me. And I want to tell you a little story that is non-fiction. So this is non-fiction by Professor Cole Chin, and it's fascinating, especially for those of my American friends. If you think the riots that are happening in the UK today are anything to go by, this is quite a shocker, actually, and this was barely a century ago. So my father grew up in Nechells with Ozzy Osbourne and the Cray brothers. So this book is really helping me to appreciate and understand some of the stories that he told me of his childhood and his grandparents and his growing up. So it's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to read you a section from it, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit of non-fiction that I know about this. So basically, there were I hope you've watched the Peaky Blinders with Cillian Murphy playing Tommy Shelby. My father was also a Tommy, but he was no Tommy Shelby. I was quite scared of my father, actually. I think my mom and every one of us were. He was not a very kind person, and this is really interesting. So, like, for example, in here, sorry, cats. The nearest slogging gangs to Aston were those of Nechells, focused on Charles Arthur Street, the Duddeston centred on Great Lister Street and Cromwell Street. Gangs also remained in the Digbeth area, such as that in Oxford Street, and by October 1888 it was feared that ruffianism was increasing in severity both in Birmingham and Aston, whilst there was evidence of a rudimentary organisation to some gangs. So the Aston Sloggers was heightened in 1889, when 5 of them were charged with assaulting the police, and what they did to the police was horrendous. Several stones, bugs. Several stones were thrown from the gang members outside, and 7 or 8 of the gang took off their belts and struck several policemen. Now, I want to talk to you about this, because when I was a little girl, my dad used to take the belt on me, and the buckle was incredibly painful. My father was a middleweight boxer, so he always used to say he daren't hit us with his hands because he would kill us. His hands were weapons. So instead, we would be hit with objects. So for me, I would quite often get the belt and the buckle. When my little sister was 13, I remember me and my mum trying to pull him off her when he unscrewed the leg of a wooden table and belted her quite harshly for a very long time with the leg of this table. But he would never use his fists on us because he saw them as weapons. Now, what's interesting with these gangs of Birmingham, there's different reasons as to why they were called Peaky Blinders, but I'll go into that in a minute. Let me read this to you for now, because this really, I never knew that the belt and buckle was a Peaky Blinder thing. I just thought it was my dad's, nearest at hand at the time. But it's actually from generations and what the Peaky Blinders used to do. So hear this. Only a few other towns had a gang problem like Birmingham and Aston. Liverpool had its cornermen, and they were street gangs in London from at least the 1880s, while Manchester and Salford had scuttling gangs. The Scuttlers have been regarded as Britain's first youth cult, but that designation should be given to jointly to the Sloggers. Both sets of youths joined territorial gangs, both fought each other viciously, and both hurled stones at their enemies and then fought close up with belts. In his deeply researched book on the gangs of Manchester and Salford, Andrew Davies highlighted an article on Scuttlers and Scuttling by Alexander Devine, published in The Guardian in 1890. It explains the use of the belt as a weapon. The most dangerous part of the belt is the buckle, and this is made of brass and usually measures about 3 inches in diameter, though I have seen them much bigger and smaller. They are used by the scuttler, fastening one end of the strap to the buckle end, and then winding his hand around the strap from the wrist, he grasps the lever, leaving about 8 to 10 inches of the belt to be used as a weapon. The winding of it around his arm prevented it from being readily dragged from him in a fight. That's exactly what my dad used to do. And I never knew that this was a Peaky Blinder thing. The only thing that differed between the Scuttlers and the Sloggers was that the former wore brass-tipped clogs, whilst the latter favoured steel-tipped boots. By the late 1880s, sloggers gangs were causing trouble across Birmingham as well as in Aston. Newspapers reported frequent stone throwings, assaults and attacks by named slogging gangs. Nechells, Floodgate Street, Allison Street, Milk Street and Charles Henry Street, as well as Blucher Street and Legg Street. Unsurprisingly, the slogging gangs of Aston and Birmingham were notoriously local, but they had also gained ill repute nationally. In 1882, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph noted sarcastically, "The latest gift of Birmingham to the institutions of our country is the slogging gang. The name is not a pretty one, but it is appropriately descriptive. Its members are roughs, probably so called because their manners lack the mildest engendered by a belief in the right of property and the sanctity of life." From 1890, the sloggers and slogging gangs were also known by another name that would become even more infamous, the Peaky Blinders. So I know that there's stories about flat caps and razor blades. They'd have their little caps on, like farmer's caps, so if you're in America and not sure what we need, little round ones with a rim. And they would put in either coins or steel pieces or razor blades in these little caps. And then what they would do is they'd take the cap off or headbutt, and they would cut the eyes of the person they're about to seriously ruin their life. And the blood would run from their eyes down their face, and they wouldn't be able to see or defend themselves. And that's how they got beat up. So I think there's some iffy... It's not convinced whether these razor caps were part of the Peaky Blinders or came in afterwards. But if you've seen Peaky Blinders, Tommy Shelby uses that when he's up against the Roman gypsy Lee family, and when they mock him, he takes off the middle part of his newsboy type cap, and with his right hand, from the harder peaker, which disposable safety razor blades poke out, makes his eyes bleed. And that's where the name Peaky Blinders comes from, because they blinded people and then they'd attack them. So I think it's, these real Peaky Blinders were as vicious and as violent as their fictional counterparts. But their weapons were buckled belts, stones, knives, coshes and boots, all of which the Peaky Blinders owned as part of their clothing, or else were close to hand and free or cheap to obtain. Some of the gangs engaged in petty protection. They were only loosely organised and were more concerned with fighting than making money illegally. Most importantly, they were not glamorous, they were brutal and they were vile. Now, I find this fascinating because I guess, am granddaughter to the Peaky Blinders. So my father was born after that time, but he did hang out with the Cray brothers. He knew Ozzy Osbourne, who also grew up in the same street of them in one of the roughest parts of Birmingham. I think it was Nechells. And I remember my dad saying that they used to bully Ozzy Osbourne, and they were absolutely mortified when he became a very famous singer. What better way to teach your bullies a lesson, should it? Seriously. So, yeah, I credit to my father. He did, in his word, get us out of the slums of Birmingham. He moved us to Devon, and he put myself and my younger sister into boarding school, and he tried very hard to give us a better life than what he had been given in Birmingham. He didn't want us in the gangs or anything. I remember when I was 17 and I moved back to Birmingham to go to Matthew Bolton College in Birmingham and do my A-levels. And there was a couple of different guys also from the gangs, historically from types of gangs in Birmingham. And they were really interested in me and my sister, but in order to kind of like hurt us, in order to, have some revenge on their father's issue with my father. So I found it fascinating how you had this generational revenge thing where it's like, I didn't have that. I was like, well, I don't give a monkeys who you are or what our parents did, because it wasn't us, wasn't me. But they never thought like that. But in Birmingham and in my family, on my mum and dad's side, they'd all buy a house on the same street and live really close to each other. So my father really struggled with the fact that I left Birmingham and I left home and I travelled and I got a career and I didn't get married till late. It was not the done thing, really. And I think he always saw me as a bit of a traitor for leaving Birmingham and going and doing my own life, because you just don't do that. You stay with your family. So it's fascinating reading this true story of Peaky Blinders. It's just been really interesting listening to it. And I feel great sorrow for, you know, the people who were Peaky Blinders and grew up like my parents and their parents, like my grandparents and great-grandparents, because they never really knew how to, I don't know, be civilised. My dad was really scary, and he was not a nice person, and he was violent for as long as I knew. And everyone in our family was terrified of him. We didn't see him as a good father. You know, my mum was terrified of him and stayed with him out of fear. In her words, better the devil you know than you don't. We were all terrified of him. He was awful to my brother. He was violent to everyone, really. And it's funny because I don't really remember being hit by the belt, just being chased. But the times where I got caught and then I got the belt, I don't actually remember. That is things that I've blocked from my memory. And I've been doing a lot of work with just removing trauma. And one of the things I love about my energetic practice is that I don't have to know what that trauma is or think about it or talk about it. That's why I don't like counselling, because you just get it out of your system and be done with it. I don't need to carry trauma around like suitcase and luggage that I cling on to for the rest of my life. I had an argument with a spiritual person about that once, where she was saying, oh, you have to hang on to your trauma, it's part of you, it's what makes you you. And I'm like, well, not really, because we've had, you know, many experiences in multiple different lifetimes of things that have happened, and you certainly don't want to hang on to every single thing in every different lifetime, you know. So I'm loving this book. So it's really interesting. And do you know what? They ham up the violence going on in the UK at the moment. And while it's not nice and not pretty, it is nothing like what it was a century ago. I mean, they were brutal to the police. They had no respect. They had no control. Not until the Irish police came over. Then they sorted them out and put an end to the Peaky Blinders. Which is just as well, because they were a bunch of criminals. And I'm not proud that I come from a line of Peaky Blinders, but I'm also not ashamed because it wasn't me. And I think it's important not to be ashamed of where you come from, to just accept it and know it. But yeah, I find it fascinating. I never knew that the belt was the Peaky Blinder thing. I just thought that was my dad's thing. So it's really interesting. I'll let you know more as I read through it. So I was in Ireland researching and reading this book for my next book, because I'm going to do a little bit of sci-fi Peaky Blinder stuff. So there's 2 books I'm kind of working on, because I have a really low boredom threshold, so I never work on the same book only. I have to be in a mood. I guess it's the project manager in me, where I'm too used to jumping between different projects. So I'm working on a book called The Little Witch, which is about an alien who is a witch on our planet from Africa. And I'm working on, I haven't found a title for this one yet, so if you've got any ideas, let me know. But an alien in the Peaky Blinder family in the 1800s. So it's going to be an alien who is adopted by a Peaky Blinder family, and how the alien works with them and grows up with them. So yeah, any idea of a title, let me know. But those are the 2 books I'm working on. So research in Ireland and this book has been really fascinating. And it's also been quite warming to see how my family was the way it was, why they were like that. I just find it amazing. Great book.